Well, today I am going to be talking to you about the books that I read in December. I am going to do wrap-ups a little bit different this year. Like, not too dramatic, it's just about how I talk about the books in what order. Because I do genuinely like sitting here for however long I sit here and talk about all the books that I read. But I know it can get a little annoying, so I'm going to start organizing the videos by genre instead of just talking about them in the order that I read them. That way, if you prefer just hearing about one genre or such, then you could skip to it, obviously, with the chapters. I'm going to get into the stats because I do have 13 books to talk about today. Starting off, I read 13 books, and I don't know how many pages I read at this moment right now. Obviously, I'm going to put it on the screen. And then we can get into the genres. So, I read the most of comics. Obviously that kind of goes into the genre area that we all put it there at 31%, but technically in terms of content and consumption I read more horror, and we'll get into why that is technically later. My average rating was 3.73 and I know exactly why it's there. And then the graph does become skewed left because most of my ratings fall at a 4 or a 4.25 and everything else has just 1 in it. When we look at formats, I didn't have access to my cloud library at the beginning of the month, so I wasn't able to listen to any audiobooks or have access to library ebooks, which is why I do have a lot of books to show you from my physical TBR, and that ends up being what the most of what I read. 62% of what I read last month was physical, but the other 32% or 38%, sorry, is coming from the end of the month where I did have access again to my online library borrowing thing. And then finally, to talk about age range, adult and YA are tight, of course, and I did read 1 middle grade book. I will be going in order of what I read most of from what I read least of at the end of the video, which means we're going to start off with comics. I don't know why I'm looking for them because I read them on my cloud library. The first one I want to talk about is Something is Killing the Children. This is about a town which has a bunch of missing children, and some kids end up coming back from the events in which kids go missing, and they see these horrific things, but none of them really talk about it, especially one of our main characters who saw all his friends literally being slaughtered in front of his eyes by a creature. So Erica Slaughter, the most awesome name ever, she comes to town to kind of get rid of the creature. And she's that mysterious, you don't know anything about me, but I know everything about you type of girl. I love her so much. And I do really like this comic. This is volume 1, which is the bind up of the number 1 to 5. I really did like the art style. I find myself being a really big hit or miss person when it comes to art style in comics or graphic novels, and I really did like this one. I think my favorite page was where we get introduced to Erica Slaughter. That page is literally so visually pleasing to my eyes, the colors and everything like that. In terms of the story though, I feel like it is kind of underdeveloped, and we kind of are more so focused on her and this kid defeating the creature as opposed to kind of getting to know why this is happening, getting to know more about the characters' backgrounds and things. So I feel like it can be developed a little more, and it probably will be in the second volume. I currently have it on hold, so I'm going to read that this month, and I'll let you know in February what I thought about that one. But yeah, overall, a nice one. I think I'd recommend it. It is a little bit gory. Like, it doesn't go as far as it can, but it still does go far, so just be wary of that. And then, why I was talking about technicalities earlier, I read 3 comics in the Ufology series that's going on, but each of them are like 25 pages. I don't really know what to say about what this one's about because I don't really know what it's about from what I got. I think this girl and her friend, or someone she was on a date with, go to this house, and they encounter an alien-like creature, and she ends up getting powers from it, and she and another one of her friends tries to figure out what exactly happened. It's very confusing. It's very much relying on you to be as confused as the main characters are, but it doesn't work because we get introduced to a lot of elements that are just not being revealed in a friendly way, if you know what I mean. It's a kind of confusing. I'm not liking it as much as I thought I was, so I'm not necessarily eager to read the rest of the comics. I know there's a bind up, so eventually I'll probably just request the bind up from my library, but yeah, this one I'm kind of just indefinite about, so check it out. It's a sci-fi, so if you want to read more sci-fi, definitely look into it, but personally I'm not really enjoying it that much. We could talk about horror, so I'll start with the arc that I read. I read The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. This is about a woman, Alice I believe her name was, and her documentary crew who go to film a documentary about a town that had all its residents go missing in the 50s. So she's just filming a documentary about this, and it's a horror book, so obviously stuff starts to go wrong. It's claimed to be a mix between Midsommar and the Blair Witch Project, which I find interesting. It's definitely why I requested it, so I was really happy when my request was accepted. And the one that's being released in early this year is the English translation, because this was originally published in Sweden. And so I read the translated version. I liked this one actually. When you look at what I rated it, it does lie pretty average, but I feel like my feelings are more positive than what the rating expresses. I liked the kind of atmospheric vibes it gives off. It's very much describing the town and the places that they're visiting and the things that they are shooting, which is much of the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book is where all this bad stuff starts to happen and there's more action and things like that, and I liked that element too. But as someone who does like atmospheric books, I did like learning or kind of visualizing the town in which they are in. There's also a dual perspective almost. I forget if Alice's perspective is in first person, but there's a second timeline in which we're reading from in third person of the events as they're taking place. So we transport back to the 50s, following a woman, but we kind of see what unfolded before our eyes, which I think works really well because Alice and her team aren't necessarily trying to solve the mystery. They're just there to film the documentary, right? So we don't really get much of the mystery revealed from that timeline. So seeing the dual perspectives I think works really well. I definitely see the influences in Midsommar and Blair Witch. Blair Witch more so is that general, they're filming a documentary kind of thing, but with how the mystery turns out and such, it kind of works in that way that Midsommar does. What I didn't like is the characters. I didn't really care about them. Alice is the one that gets developed the most. I swear, I could have sworn to you, her and her friend, whose name I've also forgotten, were going to be a thing, right? Like, I thought this was going to have sapphic love. And if you read the beginning of the book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. And it's trying to push you onto another relationship she kind of develops with one of the other guys. Ugh. So sad, so tragic, so tragic. I also thought that the mystery could have been talked about more and developed more, because we get very surface level of what happened and what kind of partook in this town, right? And I, as someone who's just like really interested in stuff like this, I just really wanted to know more about it. I wanted to know the motivations of the main antagonist, but we kind of just get from like a third person perspective of everything that happened, so it doesn't really go into details, but not something really that I'm too much getting down on. It's just, I think that's my main criticism. So I definitely think you should check it out when it comes out. I think it's interesting enough, and the writing style is pretty nice as well. And then the next two books I have are Christmas horror. I decided that my treat for the end of the semester was to buy myself some new books, and I decided to buy Christmas horror books. So first here I have to talk about The Visitor by Sergio Gómez. This is a Christmas horror novella about a group of people that get stuck in a diner, and they end up kind of being hunted by a creature. I wonder what that creature is. I could have never guessed before I read this book. I absolutely love this cover. It has that buttery cover, and even though my favorite covers are matte, I think buttery covers come in second place. They're just so nice, and it's such a nice book as well because it's self-published, so you know how self-published books work. They're like very tight and they're very white. I liked it. I think my favorite thing about Sergio's writing is how well he's able to develop characters in such a short amount of time. I'm pretty sure he made us love them and be with them on their side in the first 20 pages where we're getting introduced to all of them. And I really like that introduction style as well. Very much reads like a horror movie in which we kind of follow the camera on each character as they walk into their doom. I'm very interested in how he decided to... This is a slasher, so you know people die, but I'm very interested in how he decided to kill who. You know what I mean? Like, I thought because... how do I talk about this without spoiling? I thought because he's an author of color, he would kind of take away that trope that you know which one I'm talking about, where who ends up dying ends up being on how marginalized you are, right? Who ends up dying first. And I thought he was going to kind of draw back from that. Nonetheless, really liked it. I was genuinely creeped out by the creature because it's kind of just like a very silent, very motivated, gets the job done kind of creature. So those tend to be the most scariest, and it reminded me much of another character or creature I saw in a movie once, which is probably why it was so scary to me, because I was able to visualize it. And then the last horror book I have to talk to you about is Secret Santa by Andrew Shaffer. Everyone hates the idea of this book, and I am here to tell you if it is as bad as you think it is. Spoiler alert, it is not. This is about Lucy, who works in publishing, and she was recently released from her job. And it's the 80s, by the way, for context, very important. She ends up applying to Blackwood Patterson, which is a very drab, dark building with very dark people. In terms of like, they're just sad and depressed and just weird, very campy. The camp definitely does serve when it comes to the setting and the characters. I hate comparing to Tim Burton, but much like a Tim Burton kind of building and characters, they're very dramatic, very over-enunciated. And she gets the job, but her co-workers start playing pranks on her in bad nature. And then at the Secret Santa gift exchange, she does receive a gift despite her just arriving, and she doesn't know who it's from, but it ends up being something from her past that she recognizes. And of course, bad stuff starts to happen. Look, it's very much written like an 80s Lifetime movie would be produced. You know, it reads like a Lifetime movie, and then you put in that element of 80s, and in my head I just get like grainy imagery the entire time. I thought the campy setting and characters were really cool too, because it works with what this book was trying to do. It was trying to be a little cheesy, and when of course he does that on purpose, it works, as opposed to if it were meant to be, I don't know, something else, then it probably wouldn't have worked as well. I read it fairly quickly because the writing style is easy to get into, and it works very well with what this book is trying to kind of give off. And I thought the mystery was very interesting. Again, it's very much reading like a Lifetime 80s movie, so very formulaic, very easy to understand, and the info dumps that do happen more towards the end aren't annoying because of the formulaic way this book ends up taking. And it has an ambiguous ending, which is fun. I will talk about my classics first to kind of divulge from that darker area that we were in right now. I guess we're not really straying too far off the path. First, I have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. If you have not seen my edition yet, it is the Bantam Classics edition, and it's so cute. I am obsessed with the pink. This is about two houses. We have Wuthering Heights and we have Thorcross Grange. Something like that. I can never remember what the name of the other house is, but it's just the drama that partakes in these two houses over 2 decades, and it's very interesting because of the unique narration style as well. we mainly get the perspective of everything that happens in the future from Nellie, who was a servant or the nurse that worked at the house. And the beginning of the book is from a man's perspective. I forgot his name. And the end of the book is from his perspective as well. And then sprinkled in is some diary entries, some other perspectives. There's even a perspective from Heathcliff. And so it has a very unique and confusing narration style. I definitely recommend that if you read this to kind of look at the chapters and who specifically narrates them, because it can get confusing. But I did get used to it by like the third of the book. So I was fine, but that's because I did that. I looked up who was narrating each chapter. I was really scared. I'll talk about that. I was really scared that Miss Bronte was going to romanticize this relationship between Heathcliff and Kathy, which we see at the beginning of the book, because I just hate that. I expected her to kind of do that because, you know, this is an old book written in the late 19th century, so I don't know how well the perspective on things like that are. But she did not do that. She came through and she recognized multiple times throughout many of the characters how terrible Heathcliff was. Heathcliff was literally a terrible, terrible, terrible man. I think he's one of the worst men I've read about in literature. He's such a well-written character, but he's also a very terrible one to read about. Kathy herself, too, was a toxic person in that way that she's very much a girl of her nature. She's much like a society girl. She's spoiled. She's a little bit pretentious. No, she's very pretentious, actually. So if you don't like reading about rich people, I don't recommend this one. Everybody in this book is rich. This book is very somber to read, and gray and dark. That's the overall vibe. That's the vibe of Wuthering Heights, and so that ends up being the energy and the atmosphere of the rest of the book, because it's kind of like that drainage and the sad events. There's also a plague that happens throughout this book, so there's a lot of death, and it's just a very sad book to read, entertaining as well. And I would recommend it. Like, if this is on your classics to read list, I think you should pick it up. It's perfect for November. This is actually the first book I finished in December because I started it in November, because I thought that was perfect timing. I'll talk about this book and then I'll charge it, but the other classic I read in December was Beloved by Toni Morrison. Not a fan of this cover. It's not the edition I ordered. Pain. This is about Sethe and all of her trauma that comes up again in her later life after she had escaped slavery, because an old friend of hers comes to visit her, and then eventually Beloved, a woman who is kind of lost, also comes to visit her. But the thing is, Beloved is the name, or is the word that she had written on the grave of her dead child. This book is very sad to read, and it's very heavy to read, and it's a very vulnerable and emotional book, so I definitely was feeling what I was meant to feel. It's so good. The writing is so good. Like, off the bat in chapter 1, there is some horrifying imagery, but in the words that are used, it's very visually stunning, but it's also visually horrific as well. It's stunning to hear, but not to imagine. I annotated it so much, and I'm so glad I annotated it a lot, because I don't think I'm ever going to reread this book. It's a very slow book to read. I think it is gothic, but it's just, that's not the reason I don't want to reread it. It's just such a heavy and dark book to read about, because we get to so many places of vulnerability with all of our characters. And it is a horror book as well, and I really, really loved those horror elements, but even when we take away those literal horror elements that are in here, the atmosphere, the characters, the setting, it's still a book of horror because of everything that's described and talked about in here. And I think it's interesting how Morrison used all of those elements to kind of emphasize the horror of slavery and trauma and PTSD. It's the delivery of lines, which is really what impacts me. We can talk about that later with Fablehaven, but this one just sets up lines very well. There's this one at the beginning of the book about Beloved that is terrifying, and it's said in the most simple of words, but it's still really scared me because of how it was set up. It was that deep down in those big black eyes. There was no expression at all. And if you read everything before that, it's just builds up to that line. It's amazing. I also listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Toni Morrison herself. And it's a very slow audiobook to listen to, so I sped it up, but I feel like I probably would have had an even more emotional experience if I would have just kept at the pace that she was reading at. I need to expand my vocabulary. But that is beloved. That is beloved, everyone. Next, I'm going to be talking about the mysteries slash thrillers I read. I put those in the same category now. We can start with Jacoby by William Ryder. This is the first book in the Jacoby series. It's a Victorian mystery series following Abigail Rook, who newly arrives in New England, and she's looking for a job, and she comes across an ad for this investigative agency to be a secretary, and she ends up applying, and the agency belongs to Jacoby, who, I don't know, solves his own little crimes and stuff. And there's also a supernatural slash paranormal element to this as well. So it's like up to him to solve these supernatural crimes people otherwise have trouble solving. And it's really interesting. I mean, it has a lot of those classic detective vibes. It's actually really entertaining. I was scared to read this because I heard a few people talk about this and not really like it, and I understand why. It's very simple, very easy, very predictable, but Victorian mysteries are literally my comfort zone in comfort reads, so this is literally the best thing to me. I feel like it's a little bit too long. I feel like this could do well as just 250 pages as opposed to 300. But honestly, I don't mind. It's just fun. I love it so much. I have The Devil You Know by Trish Dollar. This is about Katie, who has always taken care of her family ever since her mother died and her father became incompetent of being able to take care of everyone. And she just wants to live her life like it was stolen from her. She wants to be a teenager again. And she ends up going to a party and she meets two cousins. First she meets Matt, who is charming, nice, etc, etc. And then she meets Noah, who is that bad boy-esque type. And takes them up on their offer to go road tripping with them despite her not knowing them at all. Like, truly this book would not exist if she had minded her own business, alright? But she had to say yes. I thought it was fine. This one I thought was better than I expected it to be. I wasn't really in the mood at the time that I read it for something that was too heavy. This is just like an easy YA thriller, right? I thought this one was fine. Again, it's a very kind of predictable, like, it's very obvious to me at least, and I feel like it'll be very obvious to other thriller and mystery writers who the person is that isn't saying who they are. But I don't really judge based off of predictability. Honestly, I don't really mind if a book is predictable. If it's a good book, then I'm going to enjoy it and I'm going to rate it very highly. I thought the writing was fine, the characters were fine. Katie isn't necessarily my favorite character in the world, but I do still enjoy reading from her, and it was interesting reading this because I read it directly after a book that has similar themes in terms of wanting more from life, and I significantly liked this one better. It does have the insta-love trope though, which I obviously do not like, especially as someone who is a big rooter for slow burn romance. I didn't mind it in this book though, because Noah is actually an enjoyable male love interest to read about. If you need a quick pick-me-up, I definitely think both of these are pretty good. I wouldn't expect the most from them, but you don't need to really expect the most from all the books you read. Now, the question is, do I leave this video off on a good note or a bad note? I think I'm going to leave it off on a good note, to be honest. So, therefore, I'm going to talk about the one contemporary book I read this last month, which was Looking for Alaska by Mr. John Green. This is a YouTube classic, a booktube classic, very critically acclaimed by much and many. It follows Miles, who is the nerd, not the nerd per se, but he's like the loser kid, and he reads this quote about reaching the great perhaps or something like that. And in order to get more from life, he goes to boarding school, because apparently that's what you do when you want to accomplish great things. And this literally is just about him existing at this boarding school. It's not like he does anything to kind of reach that dream. He kind of just goes to school, and that's it. Which I thought was interesting. Why? I thought he was trying to bring purpose to his life. Whatever. There's also obviously the romance bit in which he falls in love with Alaska Young, and it's like, well, he really falls hard. If you want to know what this, like, I don't want to talk about this book. I don't want to linger on it because I didn't like it, and I feel really bad because it was a gift. But I can't lie. I literally, it was a disaster. It was so hard to read this, and I try not to be harsh because I know this is his debut, and the writing honestly wasn't that bad. Probably, to be honest, some of the best writing I read this month. Besides, if you exclude Wuthering Heights and Beloved, out of all the modern books, it was probably up there with great writing, which is cool for a debut. It's just the content in which that writing was producing was terrible. This book heavily, heavily, heavily suffers from the male gaze and just the brain of a teenage boy. I don't want to read about that. I don't care to read about that. And it's so much worse when you put in the elements, the excessive elements of drugs and alcohol, etc. The etc. bit I don't really care about, but the drugs and alcohol, literally like mentioned on every page. If you read that in reviews, people are not exaggerating. It is literally mentioned every single page, and if not, then every other single page. Like, these kids have addictions, and we could have gone into so many good conversations about that, but instead it was used as a kind of amplifier to make them seem cooler or make them have more of a personality. What? In which we count down the days and then we count up the days after the big event that happens in the middle of the book. But the ending with that felt rushed. It felt like there's no true conclusion in terms of grief and getting past stuff. It's just, I was very generous with my rating, if I'm being honest. Now, we're ending this off on a great note. I thought that would be better as opposed to ending it off with Looking for Alaska. But finally, the one fantasy book I read in December was Grip of the Shadow Plague, the third book in the Fablehaven series by Brandon Mule. Okay. Literally, this is going to be my agenda that I'm going to be pushing onto everybody. You need to read Fablehaven. This book is so good. Like, even though I did like the second book better, this one still nearly reaches the same place as the second book does. Obviously, can't talk to you much about this one. I feel like there isn't much in this that, well, yeah, there actually is a lot that spoils the other two. But I will tell you, it does get more into the strategizing about kind of competing, or not competing, but bringing down the Society of the Evening Star, which is the antagonist group in this series. There's a lot more character development. We don't necessarily get introduced to a lot of more new characters. Seeing how important everyone in this book is, it's really interesting. The reason I do like the second book better is because it's more fast-paced and it's more action-packed. While I do enjoy all of the times they were just together and kind of talking about what they were going to do, I do prefer it to be action-based as opposed to strategizing. Once again, I still do like that strategizing though. So yeah, this one does have a lot of times where they're just kind of sitting around and talking, which does slow down the pacing of the book. But it's fine. We also get introduced to our first dragon in this book. I'm a fan of dragons now. Like, I never thought I would be a dragon girl, but I'm a dragon girl. Yeah, this book is also hilarious. Ooh, how did I forget to mention that? This book is hilarious. I was talking about delivery of lines earlier, and this book literally delivers so many lines that aren't meant to be funny, but they end up being hilarious. Let me say that again. I was literally laughing out loud so many times throughout this book, and it's funny because all of those bits weren't even meant to be funny. Another good thing about this book is that Seth, who typically just tends to be the trouble and setting up plot points, is starting to become his own person. He's starting to grow up, and he's starting to become more important to defeating the society, because there's kind of a diversion in plot, and which Seth follows and then Kendra follows. They kind of just do their own things in this book, and Seth is starting to become more important. And I think, honestly, Seth is starting to become my favorite character, because he just reminds me of the decisions I would make, where Kendra is smarter, she thinks about her risk, and she calculates everything to make sure nothing goes wrong, whereas Seth does what's necessary to get forward and to save everyone, as opposed to like just standing back and thinking about it. He just goes for it, and that's more of what I would do, and that's more of so why I'm starting to like him more. Ugh, the series is so good. That is it. Thank you so much for watching. Oh, sorry if that was long. I know I've been talking for a long time, but typically I can edit it down. I don't know about this time though. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more bookish content like this. Like the video, leave down a heart emoji because of my earrings. And I will see you next time. Bye.